Section 1. The River Crossing. A bugle's piercing note echoed across the black waters of the Yalu River as thousands of Chinese soldiers stepped into the freezing current, their cotton uniforms already stiffening in the sub-zero wind. This moment would reshape the Korean War and determine whether American forces would march to the Chinese border or whether Mao's gamble would drive them back to the sea. The fate of two superpowers hung on what happened next in the mountains of North Korea. The night air bit through Song Shi-lun's thin jacket as he watched his men cross the river on October 19, 1950. Steam rose from their breath in ghostly columns, mixing with the metallic smell of rifles and the earthy scent of wet canvas. The general's boots crunched through the frost-covered reeds along the riverbank, each step a small explosion in the silence that his staff tried to maintain. From Beijing, Mao's orders had been crystal clear: launch the second phase campaign and smash the United Nations forces pushing toward the Chinese border. Song commanded the 9th Army Group, 3 full corps totaling nearly 150,000 men. The 20th, 26th, and 27th Corps had been rushed from East China, pulled from comfortable barracks and thrust into this frozen hell. Many soldiers had never seen snow like this. They came from the warm rice paddies of the south, where winter meant cool rain, not the bone-deep cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. The crossing took place in waves, each regiment filing across makeshift bridges and shallow fords. Soldiers carried their weapons above their heads, gasping as the current tugged at their legs. The water felt like liquid fire against their skin, a cruel paradox in temperatures that would drop to 30 below. Many stumbled on the slippery rocks, their cotton-soled shoes providing no grip on the ice-glazed stones. What struck Song most was the silence his men maintained. No shouting, no complaints, just the steady splash of boots through water and the occasional cough quickly stifled. These were veterans of the Civil War, men who had learned that noise meant death. They moved like ghosts, disappearing into the Korean mountains beyond the river. But Song harbored a growing dread that he kept locked behind his weathered face. His men wore the same thin cotton uniforms they had trained in back in East China. Winter parkas, gloves, proper boots, all of these remained unknown quantities, stuck in supply depots, or simply non-existent. The quartermaster reports painted a grim picture. Winter gear would not catch up to the frontline units for weeks, if at all. The general pulled his own inadequate coat tighter as he studied the intelligence reports by lamplight. American forces under General MacArthur were racing north, confident that Chinese intervention was a bluff. They had no idea that Song's divisions were already moving through the mountain passes, following ancient paths that wound through valleys so narrow that artillery would be useless. Beijing's objective burned in his mind like a fever: encircle and destroy the US. 1st Marine Division and attached 7th Infantry Division elements around Chosin Reservoir. The Chinese staff believed that surprise and night maneuvers would offset American advantages in artillery and air power. The plan looked elegant on paper, converging attacks from multiple directions, movement by night, concealment by day. Song's communications network relied on runners rather than radios, which were scarce and vulnerable to interception. Orders would travel from his headquarters to division commanders, then down to regiments and battalions through a chain of young men who memorized messages and ran through the darkness. In this landscape of frozen ridges and narrow valleys, a misdelivered order could doom an entire regiment. The soldiers crossing the Yalu had no idea what awaited them in the mountains around Chosin. They carried the standard load: 2 grenades, 60 to 90 rounds of ammunition, a rice cake that would soon freeze solid as stone, and a small shovel for digging in the hard ground. Many shouldered captured Japanese rifles from the Civil War, weapons that would jam when lubricants congealed in the mountain cold. As dawn approached, the last elements of the 27th Corps disappeared into the Korean hills. Song watched the empty riverbank, knowing that his next glimpse of these men would be in battle reports' casualty lists, written in the red ink that would stain this campaign from beginning to end. In the growing light, ice began forming along the river's edge, where thousands of boots had churned the water. The crossing was complete, but Song understood that the real test lay ahead in mountains where the cold would prove as deadly as any American weapon. Can you imagine stepping into that freezing river, knowing that the thin cotton on your back was all that stood between you and a Siberian winter? If you're watching this from your warm home, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the forgotten side of history. It's 8 p.m. here in Los Angeles, have not from Linge, and these soldiers deserve to have their story told. The 9th Army Group had vanished into Korea like smoke. But soon the mountains around Chosin would echo with bugles and gunfire as Song's plan unfolded in ways no one could predict. Private Chen Wei's canteen cracked against his teeth like a bell. The water inside transformed to solid ice as his battalion stumbled through another night march in the Korean mountains. These were the hours that would determine whether Chinese soldiers could endure what no army had attempted before fighting a modern war in conditions that killed men faster than bullets. The march from the Yalu to Chosin Reservoir stretched across 2 weeks of frozen hell. Each night, Song Shilun's divisions covered more than 30 kilometers through terrain that seemed designed to break human will. The temperature plunged to 20 below, then 30 below, with wind that cut through cotton uniforms like razors through paper. Chen's breath formed ice crystals that clung to his collar, and every exhale felt like losing a piece of his soul to the mountain air. The soldiers had detrained at Linjiang wearing the same thin cotton uniforms they had worn crossing the Yalu. No winter parkas materialized from the supply dumps. No insulated gloves appeared in the equipment lists. The men wrapped newspapers around their feet inside boots that turned rigid as wood in the cold. Some tore strips from blankets to bind around their hands, creating crude mittens that still allowed them to work rifle bolts. Chen chewed on what had once been a millet cake, now transformed into something resembling granite. The sweetness was still there, buried under the texture of frozen stone, but eating it meant risking broken teeth. Around him, his comrades did the same, gnawing at rations that could have been used as ammunition in a desperate moment. Water was worse. Canteens froze solid within hours, forcing men to melt snow in their mouths or hold metal bottles against their bodies, sharing precious body heat with inanimate objects. The night marches followed ancient principles adapted for modern warfare. Movement by night, concealment by day, a doctrine that meant sleeping in snow-covered foxholes and waking with ice in their hair. Chen's company moved in single file along goat tracks that wound through valleys so narrow that the stars seemed close enough to touch. Every step had to be silent, every cough smothered in sleeves already stiff with frozen breath. Communication relied on sounds that seemed to emerge from the mountain itself. Bugles would pierce the darkness at crucial moments, their brass notes carrying orders across ridges where radio waves could not reach. Whistles provided more subtle signals. 2 sharp blasts meant halt, 3 meant move forward. Colored flares bloomed against the black sky like deadly flowers, each hue carrying a different message to companies spread across miles of frozen terrain. The doctrine was simple: close with the enemy. Chinese staff officers had studied American tactics and concluded that their firepower advantage evaporated when fighting moved to bayonet range. Air attacks became impossible when Chinese and American soldiers occupied the same bunkers. Artillery support disappeared when the front lines blurred into confusion. Get close enough to smell the enemy's fear, and modern technology became useless. But Chen had begun to notice something during the long marches that chilled him more than the mountain air. Men were disappearing not from enemy action, but from the cold itself. They would fall out of formation during rest breaks and never get up. Others would complete the night's march, then settle into defensive positions and simply freeze in place. The most disturbing discovery came when Chen's platoon occupied hills west of the reservoir. They found what appeared to be an entire company of their own troops, arranged in perfect attack formation, weapons ready, grenades in hand, faces set in expressions of determined fury. But they were statues now, locked in ice at 30 below zero. The Ice Sculpture Company, the men called it, voices dropping to whispers. Some had been there for days, frozen in the exact positions they had taken when the cold claimed them. Chen stared at these ice soldiers and wondered if they had known what was happening. Had they felt the cold seeping into their bones, stealing their movement inch by inch? Or had adrenaline and determination carried them forward until their hearts simply stopped beating? The weapons told their own story of this Arctic warfare. Chen's Mosin Nagant rifle required constant attention. He kept the bolt carrier inside his shirt, against his skin, to prevent the action from freezing. Loading a round meant pulling the metal from his body warmth and inserting it quickly before ice could form in the chamber. His ammunition was a mix of Chinese, Soviet, and captured Japanese rounds, each type requiring different handling in the extreme cold. Other soldiers carried PPS submachine guns, the burp guns that fired so fast they sounded like fabric tearing. But lubricants turned to glue in this weather, and many weapons simply refused to function. Some squads used animal fat scavenged from abandoned villages, melting it over tiny fires and applying it to rifle bolts with strips of cloth. November 27th approached like a deadline written in ice. Chen's battalion received orders through the runner network attack positions around Udamni at exactly 10 p.m. The Marines and Army units clustered around Chosin Reservoir had no idea that 40,000 Chinese soldiers were watching them from ridges that seemed empty as the moon. The preparation was unlike anything Chen had experienced in the Civil War. Political officers moved among the men, delivering short mobilization talks about resisting America and aiding Korea. The phrases, "fight one more day, live one more day," circulated through the ranks like a mantra. But Chen noticed that these speeches were shorter than usual, delivered in whispers that wouldn't carry to American listening posts. As darkness fell on November 27th, Chen checked his equipment one final time. 2 grenades hung from his belt, their metal surfaces warm from his body heat. 60 rounds of ammunition filled his pouches, each cartridge individually tested to ensure it would chamber in the frozen rifle. His small shovel was strapped to his pack, ready to dig fighting positions in ground hard as concrete. The bugle call that would signal the attack was still hours away, but Chen could feel the tension building along the ridge lines like electricity before a thunderstorm. Consider what it would feel like to lie motionless in snow for hours, waiting for a signal that would send you charging toward machine gun nests in 30 below darkness. At exactly 10 p.m., the first bugle sounded across the hills around Udamni, and Chen Wei rose from his frozen hole to join an attack that would echo through history. The brass mouthpiece burned against Corporal Liu's frozen lips as he raised the bugle to signal 40,000 Chinese soldiers to rise from the snow and charge into the darkness. This single note would announce to the world that China had entered the Korean War not as a tentative participant, but as a force prepared to bleed the mountains red rather than allow American troops on their border. At exactly 10 p.m. on November 27th, 1950, Liu's bugle pierced the Arctic silence around Udamni like a blade through silk. The sound bounced off ridgelines and rolled through valleys where American Marines huddled in their sleeping bags, unaware that death was already moving toward them through the darkness. The metallic tang of the instrument mixed with the copper taste of blood in Liu's mouth as the cold split his lips, but he held the note until his lungs burned. Around the reservoir, other bugles answered from invisible positions. Then came the whistle's sharp blasts that cut through the wind like birds crying in the night. Colored flares bloomed against the black sky, red for advance, green for concentrate fire, white for medical assistance. The entire mountain range seemed to come alive with signals that had been rehearsed during the long march from the Yalu. The 20th Corps struck Udamni from multiple ridges simultaneously, exactly as Song Shilun had planned. Companies that had been invisible in the snow for hours suddenly materialized like demons emerging from hell itself. Chen Wei found himself running down a slope so steep that each step threatened to send him tumbling into the darkness below. Around him, his platoon moved in the practiced wedge formation they had drilled during the Civil War, but this time, the enemy fired back with weapons that lit up the night like deadly fireworks. The initial penetrations came faster than anyone had expected. Chinese soldiers moved with a speed born of desperation, and cold standing still meant freezing to death, so movement became survival itself. Within the first hour, multiple road segments around Udamni had been cut by sappers who crawled through positions that American sentries had assumed were impassable. But the cold proved as dangerous as any enemy fire. Chen's Mosin Nagant rifle jammed after the third shot, the bolt frozen solid despite his efforts to keep it warm. Around him, other soldiers faced the same crisis weapons that had functioned perfectly in the warm barracks of East China, now refused to fire in temperatures that turned metal brittle as glass. The sound of rifle bolts being worked frantically echoed across the battlefield, a metallic percussion that mixed with the crack of incoming fire. Private Wang, running beside Chen, carried a captured American burp gun, a Thompson submachine gun taken during an earlier skirmish. But the 45 caliber ammunition was rationed to just 1 magazine per man, forcing him to make every shot count. When the gun jammed after a short burst, Wang threw it aside and pulled out the Japanese Type 38 rifle that served as his backup weapon. The bolt action worked smoothly in his hands, a testament to engineering that had been tested in the brutal winters of Manchuria. The assault doctrine played out exactly as the staff officers had predicted. As Chinese soldiers closed the distance to American positions, the advantage of superior firepower began to evaporate. Artillery became useless when the combatants occupied the same bunkers. Air support disappeared in darkness that made friend and enemy indistinguishable. Tank guns could not depress low enough to hit targets that emerged from spider holes just meters away. Liu the bugler followed behind the assault waves, carrying extra grenades and satchel charges for bunker entrances. His secondary role was demolitions. When the initial attack troops breached American positions, he would rush forward with explosives to clear any strongpoints that resisted. The canvas bag on his back contained 4 stick grenades and 2 satchel charges, their fuses carefully protected from moisture that could render them useless. But the reality of close combat proved more chaotic than any training had prepared them for. In the darkness, Chinese soldiers found themselves firing at muzzle flashes, unable to distinguish individual targets. The Americans responded with a volume of fire that seemed impossible, machine guns that never seemed to run out of ammunition, mortars that dropped shells with mechanical precision, rifles that cracked faster than men could work, bolt actions. Chen dove behind a boulder as tracer rounds streaked past his head like angry hornets. The phosphorus trails burned green and red in the darkness, beautiful and deadly. He could hear Wang cursing in the local dialect as he struggled with his rifle bolt, the metal so cold that skin stuck to it when touched with bare hands. Other soldiers had learned to work their weapons through thick mittens, sacrificing dexterity for the ability to avoid frostbite. The assault waves came in predetermined intervals, first the rifle companies, then the support elements with heavier weapons. Each wave carried specific objectives: cut the roads, isolate the strongpoints, prevent reinforcement. The coordination required precise timing, but timing became impossible when runners carrying orders collapsed from exposure before reaching their destinations. One squad had reportedly crawled for 3 hours to reach within 15 meters of a marine bunker, then waited motionless in the snow for the bugle signal. When Liu finally saw them rise for the attack, their eyelashes were white with ice, and their movements seemed mechanical, like wind-up toys running down. They covered the final distance in seconds, but half fell before reaching the American position. The fighting at Udamni revealed the true cost of China's tactical doctrine. Getting close enough to neutralize American firepower meant accepting casualties that would have broken units trained in conventional warfare. But these were veterans who had learned during the Civil War that retreat meant defeat, and defeat meant death. Picture yourself in that frozen darkness, listening to bugles and gunfire echo off mountains while you tried to work a rifle bolt with hands that could no longer feel the metal. As dawn approached, the road segments around Udamni lay in Chinese hands, but the cost had been written in blood across snow that would remain stained until spring. Sergeant Ma Jiwei pressed his back against the frozen earth wall of a captured American foxhole, listening to the metallic ping of grenades bouncing off ice before exploding in showers of dirt and shrapnel that glittered like deadly snow in the moonlight. At Hagaru-ri, the war had devolved into something medieval hand-to-hand combat in trenches, where men died for inches of ground that would be retaken before dawn, lost again at sunrise, and fought over until the mountains themselves seemed to bleed. The 26th Corps had seized the high ground overlooking Hagaru-ri during the initial assault, but taking the ridges proved easier than holding them. American forces had established entrenched perimeters that turned every approach into a killing field. Ma's company occupied positions that changed hands 3 times during the first night alone, leaving the trenches littered with bodies from both sides that froze solid within hours. The grenade duels lasted through the sub-zero nights like a deadly game of catch played with explosives. Chinese soldiers would pull the pins and count to 3 before throwing, trying to time the detonation perfectly to prevent the Americans from throwing them back. The metallic sound of grenades hitting ice became as familiar as breathing: ping, pause, explosion, then the wet sound of debris pattering down like rain. Ma carried 4 stick grenades on his belt, their wooden handles wrapped with strips of cloth to improve his grip in the cold. The Chinese Model 24 grenades had a 4-second fuse, but in temperatures that dropped to 34 below zero, timing became unpredictable. Some exploded early, claiming the thrower's hand along with the intended target. Others failed to detonate at all, turning into expensive clubs that soldiers hurled in frustration. The medical situation had deteriorated beyond anything the field manuals had anticipated. Chinese stretcher teams used door planks torn from abandoned Korean houses, lashing them together with rope and covering them with quilts that quickly froze stiff as boards. Evacuation from the ridges to aid stations took 6 to 12 hours along goat tracks that wound through valleys where a single misstep meant falling into ravines that would not give up their dead until spring. Medical orderlies developed a triage system using charcoal marks on patients' cheeks. An X meant evacuate immediately, a dot meant administer morphine and wait for transport that might never come. By morning, many of the dots had turned black, as frostbite claimed faces that could no longer feel the charcoal marks. Ma watched the medics work by candlelight in dugouts that reeked of kerosene smoke and gangrene. They used heated stones wrapped in straw to provide warmth for the wounded, but iodine was scarce, and many operations were performed with hand saws when proper surgical instruments froze solid. The screams echoed off the earth walls until the cold numbed vocal cords into silence. On the eastern side of the reservoir, the 27th Corps had achieved one of the war's most devastating ambushes. Elements of the U.S. 31st Regimental Combat Team found themselves caught in crossfire that seemed to emerge from the snow itself. Chinese soldiers had dug positions so well concealed that American patrols walked within meters without detecting them. The ambush began at dawn on November 28th, when morning mist still clung to the valley floor like smoke from ghostly fires. Chinese reconnaissance teams had been tracking the American column by sound-counting truck engines and estimating unit strength by the rhythm of diesel motors echoing off the hills. 8 engines per minute along the road suggested heavy motorized movement, information that traveled up the chain of command through runners who memorized engine counts like poetry. But the snow-cloaked crossfire that followed revealed the true cost of fighting in these conditions. Chinese weapons suffered the same malfunctions that plagued their enemies: bolt actions that refused to cycle, machine guns that fired 3 rounds before jamming, mortars with base plates that cracked in the ice. Some squads resorted to using pickaxes to dig shallow pits for their weapons, lining them with straw torn from village thatch roofs. The DP-27 light machine guns that formed the backbone of Chinese firepower required constant attention. Crews buried the weapons under snow to reduce muzzle flash, but this meant clearing ice from the barrel before each engagement. The drums held 47 rounds, but in extended firefights, ammunition discipline became critical. Some positions were rationed to 10 or 20 rounds per night to avoid revealing their locations. Mars Company discovered that breath crystallized in mustaches at these temperatures, forming ice that could cut lips when wiped away carelessly. Canteen lids froze to mouths, leaving bloody marks when pulled free. Men learned to share body heat with their weapons. 3 soldiers huddling around a single rifle, breathing on the bolt until the action would cycle properly. Food became another enemy. Company cooks hauled rice in canvas bags wrapped under quilts, but even this protection could not prevent freezing. Soy sauce turned to slush that had to be broken apart with knife points. Many soldiers subsisted on dry sorghum kernels that cut their gums but provided calories that kept them conscious during the long night watches. The psychological toll mounted as steadily as the physical casualties. Ma noticed that men spoke less as the cold deepened, conserving energy for basic survival. Some soldiers developed a 1,000-yard stare that had nothing to do with combat shock and everything to do with hypothermia, slowly shutting down their brains. Others became obsessed with minor tasks, cleaning rifles that were already clean, counting ammunition that had been counted dozen times, arranging equipment in patterns that made sense only to minds struggling against the cold. Village civilians offered the only respite from the military nightmare. In hamlets near the reservoir, Korean families traded hot millet porridge for blankets or knives, desperate for anything that might help them survive a winter that was killing soldiers trained for warfare. Most homes lacked fuel, and chimney smoke risked discovery by American air patrols that appeared like vultures whenever the sky cleared. Think about sleeping in a frozen foxhole where your breath turns to ice crystals that cut your throat, while enemy grenades ping off the walls around your head. But as December 1st approached, Ma could see that the Chinese offensive was achieving something unexpected. The Americans were beginning to withdraw, and the road south had become a corridor of burning vehicles and scattered equipment. Captain Zhou Mingshan crouched behind a shattered pine tree at Toktong Pass, watching American supply trucks crawl through the mountain defile like mechanical insects trapped in a spider's web that his engineers had spent 3 days weaving from explosives and steel. This narrow corridor represented the American lifeline cut it completely, and the Marine Division would starve and freeze in the mountains around Chosin, exactly as Song Shilun had envisioned when he drew his concentric attack plan on a map that now seemed as distant as the moon. Zhou's sappers had worked through the nights of November 29th and 30th, crawling under bridge abutments with satchel charges that weighed more than the men carrying them. The treadway bridge sections that American engineers had installed offered perfect targets: destroy them, and the entire convoy system would collapse into the ravines below. But placing the charges meant exposing themselves at ranges where American sentries could hear breathing, where a single cough would bring machine gun fire that cut through pine branches like a deadly wind. The road interdiction strategy formed the heart of Song Shilun's plan for concentric blows at Udamni, Hagaru-ri, and Koto-ri simultaneously. Chinese engineers had identified 7 critical choke points where the mountain road wound through terrain so narrow that a single demolished bridge could halt thousands of vehicles. Zhou's company held responsibility for the most important target, the bridge complex at Funshilin Pass, where the road clung to cliff faces that dropped into darkness. But the reality of mountain warfare had proven more complex than the staff map suggested. Chinese reconnaissance teams had hand-sketched their maps based on visual observation, leading to distance miscalculations of 2 to 5 kilometers that turned carefully planned convergences into disasters. Companies arrived hours late for coordinated attacks, exposing themselves to enfilade fire on ridgelines where they should have found support from adjacent units. The ammunition shortage had become critical by December 1st. Song Shilun's reports to Peng Dehuai warned that resupply efforts were falling short of requirements, with mule columns from the Yalu taking 3 to 5 nights per cycle. Only 1/3 of planned ammunition reached forward companies on some nights, forcing soldiers to strip dead enemies of cartridges and grenades. Zhou's men had become expert at identifying American ammunition types by feel in the darkness: 30-06 rounds for the Garand rifles, 45 caliber for the Thompson submachine guns, 30 carbine for the lighter weapons. The 82mm mortar crews that supported Zhou's position had been rationed to 10 to 20 rounds per night to avoid revealing their locations. Aiming stakes were carved twigs stuck in ice, since metal stakes conducted heat away from hands faster than exposed skin could tolerate. The crews fired 3 to 5 round missions, then displaced 300 to 500 meters before American counter-battery fire could find them. Zhou watched through binoculars as his sappers moved like shadows beneath the bridge structure. They had learned to work in complete silence, using hand signals that were visible only to men whose eyes had adapted to darkness so complete that stars provided meaningful illumination. Each satchel charge weighed 8 kilograms and contained enough explosive to drop a bridge section into the gorge, but the fuses had to be protected from moisture that would render them useless. The cold had become an enemy that fought alongside the Americans. Zhou's men discovered that breath crystallized in beards, forming ice masks that cut faces when removed carelessly. Some soldiers wrapped cloth around their heads, leaving only slits for their eyes, making them look like bandits from ancient legends. Others had learned to breathe through fabric filters that warmed the air slightly before it reached their lungs. Weapons maintenance consumed hours that should have been spent sleeping. Zhou carried a captured American carbine along with his standard-issue rifle, but both required constant attention. Lubricants turned to glue in temperatures that made metal brittle as glass. Some squads boiled weapon parts in water heated over tiny fires, then re-oiled them with animal fat or kerosene scavenged from Korean villages. The logistics failures cascaded through every aspect of the operation. Chinese artillery support consisted of 76mm field guns that had to be dragged by hand on sleds, since the mountain tracks could not accommodate wheeled vehicles. Gun crews fired 3 to 5 round missions before displacing to avoid counter-battery fire, but moving the weapons meant hauling them across terrain where every step risked exposure to American air patrols. Zhou's company had been reduced to 40% strength, not from enemy action, but from cold injuries that removed men as effectively as bullets. Some soldiers simply stopped during night marches and could not be revived. Others completed their missions but collapsed when the adrenaline wore off, their bodies finally acknowledging damage that determination had temporarily masked. The Chinese medical system struggled with casualties that defied conventional treatment. Frostbite cases climbed into the thousands within days, but treatment facilities lacked the resources to handle injuries that ranged from blackened fingertips to complete limb loss. Medical orderlies marked triage decisions with charcoal on patients' cheeks, but many of the evacuate marks became meaningless when transportation simply could not reach the wounded in time. Food had become another casualty of the mountain war. Company cooks tried to keep rice unfrozen by carrying it in canvas bags under quilts, but even body heat could not prevent meals from turning into projectiles hard enough to break teeth. Soy sauce froze into slush that had to be chipped apart with bayonets. Many soldiers subsisted on dry grain that provided calories but cut their mouths, leaving trails of bloody spittle in the snow. At exactly midnight on December 2nd, Zhou's sappers triggered their charges. The explosions lit up the pass like daylight for 3 seconds, sending bridge sections tumbling into the ravine with sounds like thunder rolling through the mountains. Debris rained down for nearly a minute, and when silence returned, the American supply line had been severed as cleanly as a knife-cutting rope. Can you imagine the satisfaction of watching months of preparation succeed in 3 seconds of perfectly timed destruction, knowing that thousands of enemy soldiers were now trapped in the mountains? But Zhou's celebration lasted only until dawn, when American engineers appeared with equipment that could rebuild in hours what had taken days to destroy. The whine of American bulldozers echoed through Funchal Pass like mechanical screams as Zhou Mingshan watched his carefully planned ambush transform into a lesson about industrial warfare that no Chinese manual had prepared him for. What Zhou witnessed in the hours after his bridge demolition would reshape how the People's Volunteer Army understood their enemy not just as soldiers with superior firepower, but as an entire civilization that could rebuild faster than others could destroy. The American engineering response began before the debris from Zhou's charges had stopped falling. Within 30 minutes of the explosions, reconnaissance aircraft circled the pass like metal vultures, photographing the damage and radioing coordinates to units that Zhou had not known existed. By dawn, the first bulldozers had arrived along with personnel carriers loaded with bridge-building equipment that seemed to materialize from thin air. Zhou's spotters reported the impossible. American engineers were not just repairing the bridge, they were improving it. Steel beams replaced wooden supports. Concrete foundations anchored structures that had previously relied on temporary piers. The entire operation proceeded with mechanical precision that seemed to mock Chinese efforts to fight a modern war with tools borrowed from the previous century. But the real shock came when Zhou realized that American forces had learned from the bridge attacks. Instead of concentrating their engineering efforts on single points, they dispersed teams across multiple sites simultaneously. When Chinese sappers succeeded in cutting the road at one location, alternative routes appeared within hours. The Americans seemed to possess an infinite supply of men and machinery dedicated solely to keeping supplies moving through the mountains. The fighting at Koto Ri revealed how dramatically American defensive tactics had evolved since the initial Chinese attacks. Marine commanders had studied the assault patterns at Udam Ni and Hagaru Ri, identifying weaknesses in Chinese night attack doctrine that could be exploited. Instead of linear defensive positions, they created what Chinese officers noted as fire sacks, interlocking machine gun positions that created zones of death impossible to cross regardless of courage or determination. Private Li Guangming discovered this evolution the hard way during the December 6th assault on Koto Ri. His company had approached the American perimeter using standard tactics, oblique advances along spur lines designed to avoid frontal rushes into prepared positions. But the Marines had positioned their weapons to cover these natural approach routes, turning what should have been concealed movement into exposure under multiple firing positions simultaneously. Lee carried a Japanese Type 38 rifle and 60 rounds of mixed ammunition, some Chinese, some Soviet, some captured American 30-06 cartridges that had been modified to fit the bolt action. The weapon had functioned reliably throughout the campaign, but at Koto Ri he discovered that reliability meant nothing when crossing open ground under concentrated fire from weapons that never seemed to run out of ammunition. The Chinese medical system had adapted to conditions that would have overwhelmed conventional field hospitals. Medical orderlies developed techniques for treating frostbite using friction massage and water heated over candle flames, since boiling water was impossible to obtain consistently. Amputation procedures were performed with hand saws in dugouts lit by candlelight, creating scenes that belonged in field hospitals from previous centuries rather than a modern war. Treatment protocols emphasized speed over precision. Surgeons amputated blackened fingers and toes without anesthesia, since morphine was reserved for cases where patients might survive long enough to benefit from pain relief. The triage system using charcoal marks had expanded to include additional categories. A circle meant probable death within hours, a cross meant amputation required, a dot with a line meant evacuate immediately if transportation became available. Chinese artillery support had dwindled to almost nothing by early December. The 76mm field guns that provided the heaviest fire support could not be moved quickly enough to avoid American counter-battery fire, which arrived with accuracy that suggested radar guidance systems beyond Chinese comprehension. Gun crews learned to fire single rounds and displace immediately, but this made coordinated bombardments impossible. Lee's company had been reduced to using captured American weapons when their own supplies ran out. The burp guns, Thompson submachine guns taken from casualties, provided superior firepower for trench fighting, but .45 caliber ammunition was so scarce that magazines were rationed to one per man. Some soldiers carried magazines loaded with mixed cartridges, a few .45 rounds, some .30 carbine, whatever could be scavenged from battlefield debris. The psychological pressure mounted as Chinese units realized they were fighting an enemy that seemed immune to attrition. American casualties were evacuated by helicopter, wounded men disappearing into the sky like ascending spirits. Chinese wounded, faced evacuation routes that took 12 hours or more along mountain tracks where many died from exposure before reaching aid stations. But perhaps the most demoralizing discovery was that American forces had begun using Chinese tactical innovations against their creators. Marine patrols moved at night using silence techniques copied from Chinese assault teams. American snipers established positions in areas where Chinese commanders assumed no enemy could approach undetected. The learning curve that had initially favored Chinese forces was now working in reverse. Lee watched American tanks and artillery respond to Chinese attacks with coordination that seemed telepathic. Radio communications allowed instant adjustment of fire support, bringing shells down on Chinese positions within minutes of initial contact. This technological advantage became most apparent during daylight hours, when American aircraft appeared like mechanical hawks drawn to any movement on the mountain slopes. The cold continued to claim more Chinese casualties than enemy action. Lee's platoon had developed a rotation system, where men alternated between active duty and warming stations, crude shelters, where soldiers could restore circulation to extremities before returning to combat positions. But even this innovation could not prevent the steady attrition of men who simply could not maintain body temperature in conditions that turned metal too cold to touch with bare skin. Envision yourself watching modern engineering equipment rebuild in hours what took you days to destroy, while your own wounded froze to death waiting for evacuation along mountain paths. As December 8th approached, Lee could see that the American withdrawal was proceeding with the same mechanical efficiency that characterized everything else about their military, and Chinese forces were running out of time to prevent the Marines from reaching the sea. Company Commander Tang Yongsheng raised a dented bugle to his frostbitten lips for what he knew would be the final time, the brass mouthpiece already stained with blood, from countless nights of frozen signals echoing across the Korean mountains. This moment would determine whether China's massive gamble in Korea would end in strategic victory or become a cautionary tale about challenging American industrial might with courage alone, and Tang's remaining 37 men represented the last chance to prevent the Marine Division from escaping to the sea. As December 8th dawned over the Chosin Reservoir, Tang watched American forces begin their breakout with mechanical precision that had become their signature throughout the campaign. Snowplows led the convoy columns, clearing paths that Chinese engineers had spent nights blocking with fallen trees and scattered boulders. Behind them came tanks with dozers, pushing aside obstacles faster than Chinese work parties could replace them. The entire operation proceeded with coordination that seemed to mock Chinese efforts to fight a modern war using tactics borrowed from the Civil War. But Tang's orders from division headquarters remained unchanged: reseal the road at multiple points and prevent the American withdrawal from becoming a successful evacuation. Chinese engineers had identified 17 locations where rock faces could potentially be collapsed onto the main supply route, turning the mountain road into an impassable obstacle course. The demolitions required precision timing too early, and American engineers would simply clear the debris too late, and the convoy would pass before the charges detonated. Tang's sappers had spent 3 days preparing charges along a cliff face that towered above the road like a stone curtain. Dynamite fuses had to be protected from wind that could extinguish them before reaching the main charges, but calculating burn times in sub-zero temperatures required guesswork that could prove fatal. Several earlier attempts had misfired, burying Chinese demolition teams under tons of rock and powder snow that would not release their bodies until spring. The ammunition shortage had reached critical levels throughout the Chinese positions. Tang's company possessed exactly 43 rifle rounds, 16 grenades, and 2 satchel charges, enough for perhaps 30 minutes of sustained combat against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited supplies. His men had become expert scavengers, stripping American casualties of cartridges and learning to identify ammunition types by weight and shape in complete darkness. The medical situation had deteriorated beyond any reasonable definition of battlefield care. Tang's company medic worked with a kit that contained 3 morphine injections, a handful of bandages, and iodine that had frozen into crystals requiring heating before application. Frostbite treatment consisted of friction massage and warm water when available, but most cases progressed to gangrene that required amputation with handsaws and knives sterilized over candle flames. Private Joe, one of Tang's most reliable soldiers, had discovered that body heat could thaw rifle bolts when shared among 3 men breathing on the metal until the action would cycle. This technique had become standard practice throughout Chinese units, creating scenes where soldiers huddled around weapons like primitive tribes worshipping metal gods. Some squads wrapped frozen grenades in clothing and held them against their bodies, thawing the mechanisms with warmth that they could not afford to spare. The tactical situation revealed how dramatically American forces had adapted to Chinese night attack doctrine. Marine defensive positions now incorporated lessons learned during weeks of combat, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every natural approach route. What Chinese officers had initially dismissed as inferior defensive tactics had evolved into systems that channeled attacks into predetermined killing zones, regardless of the courage or determination of the attackers. Tang observed American engineering capabilities that seemed to operate according to different physical laws than those governing Chinese forces. When his sappers succeeded in cutting the road at one location, alternative routes appeared within hours. American bulldozers carved new paths through terrain that Chinese commanders had assumed was impassable, while bridge-building teams replaced destroyed spans with structures stronger than the originals. The psychological pressure mounted as Tang's men realized they were fighting an enemy that treated obstacles as temporary inconveniences rather than decisive barriers. American casualties were evacuated by helicopter, wounded men disappearing into machines that seemed to defy gravity itself. Chinese wounded faced evacuation routes that measured in days rather than minutes, along mountain tracks where exposure claimed more lives than enemy fire. But the most demoralizing discovery was that Chinese tactical innovations were being turned against their creators. American patrols had adopted Chinese silence techniques, moving through darkness with stealth that matched anything Tang's veterans had learned during the Civil War. Marine snipers established positions using concealment methods copied from Chinese reconnaissance teams, creating situations where Chinese soldiers found themselves outmaneuvered by their own tactics. The Cold continued its relentless campaign against both armies, but American forces possessed equipment that seemed designed specifically for Arctic warfare. Tang watched through binoculars as Marines changed weapons that had frozen, discarding malfunctioning rifles and replacing them from supplies that appeared inexhaustible. Chinese soldiers faced choices between weapons that might fire and those that definitely would not, often discovering the difference only when their lives depended on mechanical reliability. Food had become another casualty of the extended campaign. Tang's men subsisted on frozen grain that cut their mouths and soy sauce that had to be chipped from containers with bayonet points. Some soldiers boiled snow with scraps of cloth, creating a warm liquid that provided psychological comfort even when it offered no nutritional value. Others had learned to locate the occasional Korean village, where civilians traded hot millet porridge for items that might help them survive a winter that was claiming non-combatants as efficiently as soldiers. Consider the desperation of preparing one final ambush with 43 rifle rounds while watching an enemy that could replace entire divisions overnight. At exactly noon on December 10th, Tang raised his bugle and blew the charge that would send his remaining men against tanks, helicopters, and the full weight of American industrial power. The harbor at Hungnam burned like a vision of hell as Chinese forces watched American ships disappear into the Yellow Sea, carrying with them the last remnants of a UN offensive that had once promised to reunite Korea under Western rule. On December 13th, 1950, the People's Volunteer Army could claim something unprecedented in modern Chinese history. They had fought the world's most powerful military to a standstill and forced its retreat from positions the Americans had considered secure. Tang Yongsheng stood among the ruins of what had been the American perimeter at Hungnam, watching smoke rise from fuel dumps that enemy engineers had torched rather than leave for Chinese forces. The acrid smell of burning diesel, mixed with the metallic scent of blood-soaked snow and the sweet stench of bodies that had been frozen for weeks. His company had been reduced to 11 men, but they had lived to see the evacuation ships fade into the winter horizon. The statistics would be debated by historians for decades, but the immediate reality was undeniable. American forces were boarding transports bound for southern Korea, abandoning positions they had held since October. Chinese propaganda would hail this as a great victory, proof that courage could triumph over industrial might when guided by correct political principles and tactical innovation. But the cost had been written in casualties that defied comprehension. Song Shilun's 9th Army Group had suffered between 30,000 and 50,000 total losses, with frostbite constituting 30 to 40% of all casualties. Entire companies had simply vanished during the night marches from the Yalu, consumed by cold that killed more efficiently than any weapon the Americans possessed. Tang remembered the burial details that had worked through the final days around Chosin. PVA burial teams marked shallow graves with reed bundles stuck in frozen ground, simple markers that would guide recovery efforts when spring finally arrived. Many bodies were buried where they fell, in foxholes that became tombs sealed by ice that would not release its dead for months. Villagers would later report finding bones scattered in ravines where wounded men had crawled to die alone in the darkness. The medical aftermath painted a picture of suffering that official reports would minimize for decades. Veterans described the stink of kerosene stoves, wet felt, and gangrenous wounds in earth shelters where candles guttered blue in oxygen-starved air. Medical stations had operated with heated stones under straw, performing amputations with hand saws when proper instruments froze solid. Iodine had been scarce, and many wounds were treated with snow and pressure bandages that provided psychological comfort rather than medical benefit. Letters home from Ninth Army, soldiers often arrived months late, carried by postal systems that functioned sporadically in war zones where transportation meant human carriers walking through mountain passes. Families learned of deaths through terse notices that listed causes as simply frost injury or combat casualty, bureaucratic language that could not capture the reality of men who had frozen to death while maintaining attack positions. Peng Dehuai's post-battle analysis would criticize the winter gear failures that had turned Chinese soldiers into casualties before they ever engaged the enemy. The Ninth Army's attrition forced rest and refit cycles that drew on Manchurian depots through January 1951, revealing supply chain weaknesses that Chinese planners had not anticipated when committing forces to Korean operations. But the strategic lessons would reshape Chinese military doctrine for the next generation. The battle had demonstrated that night infiltration and encirclement tactics could offset inferior firepower, but only if logistics and winter equipment caught up to frontline requirements. Cotton-padded suits and felt boots became priorities in military procurement, acknowledgement that wars could be lost to weather as decisively as to enemy action. Tang survivors spoke in whispers about the silent marches under aurora-like moon halos, describing how snow squeaked underfoot at 30 below zero and how every breath felt like inhaling needles. Some had developed a peculiar nostalgia for the intensity of combat that had made them feel intensely alive even while surrounded by death. Others never spoke of the campaign at all, carrying memories too terrible for civilian conversation. The cultural memory that would emerge in China centered on what propaganda called proof of spirit over hardship. The ice sculpture company became a symbol of dedication that transcended physical limitations, soldiers who had maintained attack positions even as death claimed them, demonstrating resolve that no amount of American firepower could break. Modern films would dramatize the bugle charges and frozen heroism, creating legends that honored sacrifice while obscuring the horrific waste of human life. Chinese staff officers had learned tactical lessons that would influence military thinking for decades. Layered roadblocks proved more effective than single demolition points. Deeper reserves could sustain operations when initial assault waves suffered catastrophic losses. Better winterization was essential for any future campaigns in climate conditions that turned equipment failure into death sentences. The Americans had also learned, adapting their defensive tactics and engineering capabilities to counter Chinese innovations. The technological gap that had seemed insurmountable in October had narrowed through combat experience, but Chinese forces had proven that determination and tactical flexibility could challenge superior firepower when applied with intelligence and courage. As Tang walked through the abandoned American positions, he found evidence of an enemy that had also paid heavily for the lessons learned around Chosin. Frozen blood marked defensive positions, where Marines had died holding ground against attacks that seemed to emerge from the mountains themselves. Equipment scattered in the snow suggested hasty evacuations under pressure that had forced choices between material and personnel. Think about standing in the ruins of a battle where victory was measured not in territory gained, but in proving that your nation could not be intimidated by technological superiority. The harbour at Hungnam fell silent as the last transport ships disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind a landscape transformed by 2 months of combat that had redefined what both sides understood about warfare in the modern age and the true cost of challenging American power with courage, sacrifice, and blood.